guys, welcome back to Mental Wealth Reads. We're going to get right back into Man's Search for Meaning. We're going to try and knock out about 10 pages today. I don't got too much time, so we're going to try and get, five pages double-sided going here, and then see what we get from that. So right where we started, this is technically part 4 of part 1, I think that's where we're at. But yeah, we'll get going right away. It is very difficult for an outsider to grasp how little value was placed on human life in camp. The camp inmate was hardened, but possibly became more conscious of this complete disregard of human existence when a convoy of sick men were arranged. The emaciated bodies of the sick were thrown on 2-wheeled carts, which were drawn by prisoners for many miles, often through snowstorms, to the next camp. If one of the sick men had died before the cart left, he was thrown on anyway. The list had to be correct. The list was the only thing that mattered. A man counted only because he was a prison number, or he had a prison number. One literally became a number, dead or alive, that was unimportant. The life of a number was completely irrelevant. What stood behind that number and that life mattered even less. The fate, the history, the name of the man. In the transport of sick patients that I, in my capacity as a doctor, had to accompany from one camp in Bavaria to another, there was a young prisoner whose brother was not on the list and therefore would have to be left behind. The young man begged so long that the camp warden decided to work an exchange, and the brother took the place of a man who at the moment preferred to stay behind. But the list had to be correct. That was easy. The brother just exchanged numbers with the other prisoner. As I have mentioned before, we had no documents. Everyone was lucky to own his own body, which after all was still breathing. All else about us, i.e. the rags hanging from our gaunt skeletons, was only of interest if we were assigned to a transport of sick patients. The departing Moslems were examined with unabashed curiosity to see whether their coats or shoes were not better than one's own. After all, their fates were sealed. But those who stayed behind in camp, who were still capable of some work, had to make use of every means to improve their chances of survival. They were not sentimental. The prisoners saw themselves completely dependent on the moods of the guards, playthings of fate, and this made them even less human than the circumstances warranted. In Auschwitz, I had laid down a rule for myself which proved to be a good one, and which most of my comrades later followed. I generally answered all kinds of questions truthfully, but I was silent about anything that was not expressly asked for. If I were asked my age, I gave it. If I asked about my profession, I said doctor, but I did not elaborate. The first morning in Auschwitz, an SS doctor came to the parade ground. We had to fall into separate groups of prisoners. Over 40 years, under 40 years, metal workers, mechanics, and so forth. Then we were examined for ruptures, and some prisoners had to form a new group. The group that I was in was driven to another hut, where we lined up again. After being sorted out once more and having answered questions as to my age and profession, I was sent to another small group. Once more we were driven to another hut and grouped differently. This continued for some time, and I became quite unhappy, finding myself among strangers who spoke unintelligible foreign languages. Then came the last selection, and I found myself back in the group that had been with me in the first hut. They had barely noticed that I had been sent from hut to hut in the meantime, but I was aware that in those few minutes, fate had passed me in many different forms. When the transport of sick patients for the rest camp was organized, my name, that is my number, was put on a list, since a few doctors were needed. But no one was convinced that the destination was really a rest camp. A few weeks previously, the same transport had been prepared. Then, too, everyone had thought that it was destined for the gas ovens. When it was announced that anyone who volunteered for the dreaded night shift would be taken off the transport list, 82 prisoners volunteered immediately. A quarter of an hour later, the transport was cancelled, but the 82 stayed on the list for the night shift. For the majority of them, this meant death within the next fortnight. Now the transport for the rest camp was arranged for the second time. Again, no one knew whether this was a ruse to obtain the last bit of work from the sick, if only for 14 days, or whether it would go to the gas ovens or to a genuine rest camp. The chief doctor, who had taken a liking to me, told me very furtively one evening at 9:45, "I have made it known in the orderly room that you could still have your name crossed off the list. You may do so up until 10 o'clock. I told him that this was not my way, that I had learned to let fate take its course. I might as well stay with my friends, I said. There was a look of pity in his eyes, as if he knew. He shook my hand silently, as though it were a farewell, not for life, but from life. Slowly I walked back to my hut. There I found a good friend waiting for me. You really want to go with them? He asked sadly. Yes, I am going. Tears came to his eyes, and I tried to comfort him. Then there was something else to do, to make my will. Listen, Otto, if I don't get back home to my wife, and if you should see her again, then tell her that I talked of her daily or hourly. You remember. Secondly, I have loved her more than anyone. Thirdly, the short time I have been married to her outweighs everything, even all we have gone through here. Otto, where are you now? Are you alive? What has happened to you since our last hour together? Did you find your wife again? And do you remember how I made you learn my will by heart, word for word, in spite of your childlike tears? The next morning I departed with the transport. This time, it was not a ruse. We were not heading for the gas chambers, and we actually did go to a rest camp. Those who had pitied me remained in a camp where famine was to rage even more fiercely than in our new camp. They tried to save themselves, but they only sealed their own fates. Months later, after liberation, I met a friend from the old camp. He related to me how he, as a camp policeman, had searched for a piece of human flesh that was missing from a pile of corpses. He confiscated it from a pot in which he found it cooking. Cannibalism had broken out. I had left just in time. Does this not bring to mind the story of death in Tehran? A rich and mighty Persian once walked in his garden with one of his servants. The servant cried that he had just encountered death, who had threatened him. He begged his master to give him his fastest horse, so he could make haste and flee to Tehran, which he could reach that same evening. The master consented, and the servant galloped off on the horse. On returning to his house, the master himself met Death and questioned him, "Why did you terrify and threaten my servant?" "I did not threaten him. I only showed surprise in still finding him here when I planned to meet him tonight in Tehran," said Death. The camp inmate was frightened of making decisions and of taking any sort of initiative whatsoever. This was the result of a strong feeling that fate was one's master, and that one must not try to influence it in any way, but instead let it take its own course. In addition, there was a great apathy, which contributed in no small part to the feelings of the prisoner. At times, lightning decisions had to be made, decisions which spelled life or death. The prisoner would have preferred to let fate make the choice for him. This escape from commitment was most apparent when a prisoner had to make the decision for or against an escape attempt. In those minutes in which he had to make up his mind, and it was always a question of minutes, he suffered the tortures of hell. Should he make the attempt to flee? Should he take the risk? I, too, experienced this torment. As the battlefront drew nearer, I had the opportunity to escape. A colleague of mine who had to visit huts outside the camp in the course of his medical duties wanted to escape and take me with him. Under the pretense of holding a consultation about a patient whose illness required a specialist's advice, he smuggled me out. Outside the camp, a member of a foreign resistance movement was to supply us with uniforms and documents. At the last moment, there was some technical difficulties, and we had to return to camp once more. We used this opportunity to provide ourselves with provisions, a few rotten potatoes, and to look for a rucksack. We broke into an empty hut of the women's camp, which was vacant, as the women had been sent to another camp. The hut was in great disorder. It was obvious that many women had acquired supplies and fled. There were rags, straw, rotting food, and broken crockery. Some bowls were still in good condition and would have been very valuable to us, but we decided not to take them. We knew that lately, as conditions had become desperate, they had been used not only for food but as wash basins and chamber pots. There was a strictly enforced rule against having any kind of utensil in the hut. However, some people were forced to break this rule, especially the typhus patients, who were too weak to go outside, even with help. While I acted as a screen, my friend broke into the hut and returned shortly with a rucksack, which he hid under his coat. He had seen another one inside, which I was to take. So we changed places, and I went in. As I searched in the rubbish, finding the rucksack and even a toothbrush, I suddenly saw, among all the things that had been left behind, the body of a woman. I ran back to my hut to collect all my possessions. My food bowl, a pair of torn mittens inherited from a dead typhus patient, and a few scraps of paper covered with shorthand notes, on which, as I mentioned before, I had started to reconstruct the manuscript which I lost at Auschwitz. I made a quick last round of my patients who were lying huddled on the rotten planks of wood on either side of the huts. I came to my only countryman, who was almost dying, and whose life it had been my ambition to save in spite of his condition. I had to keep my intention to escape myself, but my comrades seemed to guess that something was wrong. Perhaps I showed a little nervousness. In a tired voice, he asked me, "You, too, are getting out?" I denied it, but I found it difficult to avoid his sad look. After my round, I returned to him. Again, a hopeless look greeted me, and somehow I felt it to be an accusation. The unpleasant feeling that had gripped me as soon as I had told my friend I would escape with him became more intense. Suddenly, I decided to take fate into my own hands for once. I ran out of the hut and told my friend that I could not go with him. As soon as I had told him with finality that I had made up my mind to stay with my patients, the unhappy feeling left me. I did not know what the following days would bring, but I had gained an inward peace that I had never experienced before. I returned to the hut, sat down on the boards at my countryman's feet, and tried to comfort him. Then I chatted with the others, trying to quiet them in their delirium. Our last day in camp arrived. As the battlefront came nearer, mass transports had taken nearly all the prisoners to other camps. The camp authorities, the capos, and the cooks had fled. On this day, an order was given that the camp must be evacuated completely by sunset. Even the few remaining prisoners, the sick, a few doctors, and some nurses, would have to leave. At night, the camp was to be set on fire. In the afternoon, the trucks which were to collect the sick had not yet appeared. Instead, the camp gates were suddenly closed and the barbed wire closely watched, so that no one could attempt an escape. The remaining prisoners seemed to be destined to burn with the camp. For the second time, my friend and I decided to escape. We had been given an order to bury 3 men outside the barbed wire fence. We were the only 2 in camp who had strength enough to do the job. Nearly all the others lay in the few huts which were still in use, prostrate with fever and delirium. We now made our plans. Along with the first body, we would smuggle out my friend's rucksack, hiding it in the old laundry tub which served as a coffin. When we took out the second body, we would also carry out my rucksack, and on the third trip, we intended to make our escape. The first 2 trips went according to plan. After we returned, I waited while my friend tried to find a piece of bread so that we could have something to eat during the next few days in the woods. I waited. Minutes passed. I became more and more impatient as he did not return. After 3 years of imprisonment, I was picturing freedom joyously, imagining how wonderful it would be to run toward the battlefront. But we did not get that far. The very moment when my friend came back, the camp gate was thrown open. A splendid aluminum-colored car, on which were painted large red crosses, slowly rolled to the parade ground. A delegate from the International Red Cross in Geneva had arrived, and the camp and its inmates were under his protection. The delegate billeted himself in a farmhouse in the vicinity in order to be near the camp at all times in case of emergency. Who worried about escape now? Boxes with medicines were unloaded from the cars, cigarettes were distributed, we were photographed, and joy reigned supreme. Now there was no need for us to risk running toward the fighting line. In our excitement, we had forgotten the third body, so we carried it outside and dropped it into the narrow grave we had dug for 3 corpses. The guard who accompanied us, a relatively inoffensive man, suddenly became quite gentle. He saw that the tables might be turned and tried to win our goodwill. He joined in the short prayers that we offered for the dead men before throwing soil over them. After the tension and excitement of the past days and hours, those last days in our race with death, the words of our prayer asking for peace were as fervent as any uttered by the human voice. And so the last day in camp passed in anticipation of freedom. But we had rejoiced too early. The Red Cross delegate had assured us that an agreement had been signed and that the camp must not be evacuated. But that night, the SS arrived with trucks and brought an order to clear the camp. The last remaining prisoners were to be taken to a central camp, from which they would be sent to Switzerland within 48 hours, to be exchanged for some prisoners of war. We scarcely recognized the SS. They were so friendly, trying to persuade us to get into the trucks without fear, telling us that we should be grateful for our good luck. Those who were strong enough crowded into the trucks, and the seriously ill and feeble were lifted up with difficulty. My friend and I, we did not hide our rucksacks now, stood in the last group, from which 13 would be chosen for the next to last truck. The chief doctor counted out the requisite number, but he omitted the 2 of us. The 13 were loaded into the truck, and we had to stay behind. Surprised, very annoyed, and disappointed, we blamed the chief doctor, who excused himself by saying that he had been tired and distracted. He said that he had thought we still intended to escape. Impatiently we sat down, keeping our rucksacks on our back, and waited with the few remaining prisoners for the last truck. We had to wait a long time. Finally we lay down on the mattresses of the deserted guardroom, exhausted by the excitement of the last few hours and days, during which we had fluctuated continually between hope and despair. We slept in our clothes and shoes, ready for the journey. The noise of rifles and cannons woke us up. The flashes of tracer bullets and gunshots entered the hut. The chief doctor dashed in and ordered us to take cover on the floor. One prisoner jumped on my stomach from the bed above me, and with his shoes on. That awakened me all right. Then we grasped what was happening. The battlefront had reached us. The shooting decreased and morning dawned. Outside on the pole at the camp gate, a white flag floated in the wind. Many weeks later, we found out that even in those last hours, fate had toyed with us few remaining prisoners. We found out just how uncertain human decisions are, especially in matters of life and death. I was confronted with the photographs, which had been taken in a small camp not far from ours. Our friends who had thought they were traveling to freedom that night had been taken in the trucks to this camp, and there they were locked in the huts and burned to death. Their partially charred bodies were recognizable on the photograph. I thought again of death in Tehran. Apart from its role as a defensive mechanism, the prisoner's apathy was also the result of other factors. Hunger and lack of sleep contributed to it, as they do in normal life also, and to the general irritability which was another characteristic of the prisoner's mental state. The lack of sleep was due partially to the pestering of vermin which infested the terribly overcrowded huts because of the general lack of hygiene and sanitation. The fact that we had neither nicotine nor caffeine also contributed to the state of apathy and irritability. Besides these physical causes, there were mental ones, in the form of certain complexes. The majority of prisoners suffered from a kind of inferiority complex. We all had once been or had fancied ourselves to be somebody. Now we were treated like complete non-entities. The consciousness of one's inner value is anchored in higher, more spiritual things and cannot be shaken by camp life. But how many free men, let alone prisoners, possess it? Without consciously thinking about it, the average prisoner felt himself utterly degraded. This became obvious when one observed the contrast offered by the singular sociological structure of the camp. The more prominent prisoners, the capos, the cooks, the storekeepers, and the camp policemen, did not, as a rule, feel degraded at all, like the majority of prisoners, but on the contrary, promoted. Some even developed miniature delusions of grandeur. The mental reaction of the envious and grumbling majority towards this favored minority found expression in several ways, sometimes in jokes. For instance, I heard one prisoner talk to another about a capo, saying, "Imagine, I knew that man when he was only the president of a large bank. Isn't it fortunate that he has risen so far in the world?" Whenever the degraded majority and the promoted minority came into conflict, and there were plenty of opportunities for this, starting with the distribution of food, the results were explosive. Therefore, the general irritability, whose physical causes were discussed above, became most intense when these mental tensions were added. And it is not surprising that this tension often ended in a general fight. Since the prisoner continually witnessed scenes of beatings, the impulse toward violence was increased. I myself felt my fists clench when anger came over me while I was famished and tired. I was usually very tired, since we had to stoke our stove, which we were allowed to keep in our hut for the typhus patients throughout the nights. However, some of the most idyllic hours I've ever spent in the middle of the night for when all the others were delirious or sleeping. I could lie stretched out in front of the stove and roast a few pilfered potatoes in a fire made from stolen charcoal. But the following days I felt even more tired, intensive, and irritable. Alright, we're going to stop there. So, this is an interesting part of the book, because you get to know that he escapes, right? You get to learn that, obviously he does escape because he wrote the book, but those moments before, those few times of almost escaping, right? That proposes an interesting idea in terms of suffering, where some people who are so used to suffering may not take the chance when they're given it to escape it, right? And that is because there is a comfortability that is learned, that is acquired essentially in that state of suffering, right? And we see this a lot. We see this a lot in therapy, where a client's been suffering with whatever, depression, trauma, anxiety, whatever, for a long time, right? And there comes a point to which you as a therapist offer them, here are ways to finally start taking this into your own hands, and changing your emotionality, changing your life for the better. And what happens sometimes is that there's almost a refusal to it, right? And it's not necessarily intentional, like, no, I want to remain in suffering, but it's more of a refusal to step outside of one's comfort zone, right? You may have all of the symptoms of depression, right? But after a while, you become used to that, and those become almost comforting. Not that they're easy or enjoyable, but rather that you have learned that they are a part of your existence now, right? They're a part of your experience in life that you now know really well, right? They become a reliable part of your experience in life, and so giving those away almost feels like betraying your own identity or changing your identity, which can be frightening for some people, right? It can be a way of it just can be a kind of change that a person's not ready for, because other things come with that, right? Other things, when you're ready to start moving things and getting rid of things that have been weighing you down for your whole life, then there's that extra space, and there's both the fear that we're going to have to start filling that with positive things, which might take work, but also in removing those things, we might find something there that is something that is hard to face with, right? And Frankl, he speaks about that sort of a thing in such a way that, in his experience, he chooses camaraderie, right? He chooses to stay with the people in his care, and that's a noble thing, right? That's a good and positive reason, but to that same point, though, he chooses something that he considers to be meaningful. He chooses to be, in one sense, it's like he chose to be selfless over being selfish, but in a certain way, he was still being, self-serving, right? Because it felt more comfortable. He was at peace more to remain with the people in his care than to escape camp for his own personal needs, right? Or for his personal needs to a majority, right? So again, it's that kind of a thing, right? And this happens, and he does mention this, but this happens when a person learns or is conditioned to think one way or another, one reason or another, that they are not in control of their fate, right? They are not it does not matter what they do. Their fate will be decided by something or someone else, right? And that is something I've mentioned before in terms of learned helplessness, right? You learned that there's nothing you can do. You learn that even if you are a good person, a truly good person, your actions, your lifestyle, whoever you are, is not going to affect the outcome of your life, right? And we see this even, in just his story of how, he wasn't on the list of the 13 people that were supposed to go to this other camp, right? This central camp. And turns out he ends up being one of the 2 people saved from being burned alive with the camp, right? But it would seem, in his experience right then and there, that he had been passed over by fate, right? Assuming that because of the change in how the war was going at the time, assuming that convoy, we'll say, or that van of 13 people were going to a positive place, right? Again, kind of reinforces, or probably reinforced to him, that I am unable to have the fate that I want without hard work, right? But another thing I want to point out, and this is what is the opposite of learned helplessness, is hope, right? Despite that, Frankel is still resolved to escape, right? And of course some external things about his experience were helpful to that, right? The arrival of the Red Cross, right? The news that the war had been changing, right? And so the idea that there was still that hope was closer, right? Hope was nearer to him. And that, because the Red Cross was there, he could now escape with some a larger or bigger protection, right? Something that's more guaranteed, maybe not necessarily 100% guaranteed, but the Red Cross were around now, so he could leave the camp. He could at least attempt to escape and know that there were allies nearby, right? That being said, I think the takeaway from here is that when it comes to mental health or suffering in general, obviously hope is going to be the antidote, right? Or the thing that helps you overcome it. But the way that you avoid being swept up by this learned helplessness is to continuously find ways in order to take control of your fate, right? To find some way to have fate, or to have the outcome of your suffering be in your hands, right? And this can be in small moments, right? Like, Frankel's example, they've started planning, right? They started coming up with ways that even if it didn't end up working, the hope of that was enough to get them to the next opportunity, right? And so finding ways to inspire that hope in yourself, right? If it's, like I've had this example before, if it's an injury, right? Coming up with those milestones, right? In a month, I'm going to have this much progress, right? In a month, I'm going to be able to do this thing despite the fact that I have a broken leg. If we're talking about mental health, it's the kind of goals that we set in therapy sessions, right? A month from now, I'm going to be able to experience my symptoms just 25% less often, right? Or in 2 weeks, I'm going to discover a coping skill that works, right? Those are the things that are little constellations to the ultimate goal of eventually taking, life into your own hands and overcoming that suffering, right? I got to get going. It's got a client coming in a couple minutes, but thank you again for for listening in. Hopefully this was enlightening as always. Comments, questions, recommendations, always. And I'll catch you guys next time.